And it is my pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker. You may have heard of him. He is very, I think, well-trod in the public history and professional development grounds around here, and we hope to have him back some other time. But Benjamin Filene is the Associate Professor and Director of Public History at UNC Greensboro. He's the author of Romancing the Folk, Public Memory, and American Roots Music, which was named Notable Book of the Year by the New York Times Review. Since 2006, he's worked with his students to complete a series of community-based collaborative projects, and he consults on various exhibition projects around the country. He actually got his PhD in Yale, and prior to being an associate professor of public history at UNCG, he was a senior exhibit developer at the Minnesota Historical Society. Benjamin will be joining us today to give his talk entitled provocatively, and I think something that's going to pull us all in, Shooting Ourselves in the Foot and How to Stop. Applying PhD training to non-academic jobs. Please join me in a round of applause for Benjamin Filene.
Thank you, Ryan. It's great to be here, and I find it really heartening that there is such an event and that you guys put it on. I think that speaks well to the field. And I also have really enjoyed all the presentations I heard earlier today, and I think a lot of what the other panelists were saying, and a lot of where you were going with your questions resonates well with what it is that I want to explore here with you. So first, I want to thank Ryan and the organizers for putting this together. It's been very nice and very effective, I think. And I'm just curious, how many of you, I got a sense of this from mentions here and there, but how many of you are coming from disciplines other than history? Wow, okay, great. How many of you are coming from schools other than Duke? A few, okay. How many of you have already completed a PhD and are on the job market? Okay. And how many of you are in your first 2 years of graduate study? And then is everyone else in between? How many of you are in between? Okay. All right. Well, I'm hoping that what I want to talk about will hit all those subgroups, but definitely have time for questions as well at the end. So if you have an area that I haven't touched on at all, let me know. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about my own professional background so you have a sense of where I'm coming from in this. And then focus on why I think PhD programs really tend to be kind of woeful ways of preparing you for non-academic jobs. But then think about, well, how can we think differently about our training and our experiences with them, either looking back or going forward? How can we think differently about our PhD training so that we can be effective in doing this kind of work outside of the academy? So I self-define as a public historian, which to me that means simply that I'm interested in thinking about doing history that reaches beyond the academy, and doing history that takes whatever form it needs to have that reach, and to think about history as being relevant and meaningful to broader audiences and to contemporary questions. I never set out to be an academic. In fact, I was determined not to do that. And so what happened for my career was that I was in college and a history major, but really remarkably unconcerned about what it was that I was going to do with that. I think times have changed maybe in that way. I was just a history major, and I figured it would work out. And I was working in the career planning office, doing sort of peer resume critiquing, and an internship announcement came by for the Smithsonian. Oh my God, it was really the first time I'd ever realized that people actually work in these institutions that I loved so much, and that you could actually do it intentionally. And so I actually got an internship at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of American History. and really had a good experience. And then it was after college, I worked for a year at the Brooklyn Historical Society in New York, a temporary grant-funded position where I was sort of the right-hand man for the curator for a year. And that's really what clinched it for me to realize that this was something I really wanted to do. And so at that time, there was not this proliferation of training programs that there is now for people who want to do public history. My students get a master's in history. My students at UNC Greensboro get a master's in history with a concentration in museum studies. And there really weren't programs like that, certainly not nearly as many of them. And so I asked my mentors at the Smithsonian, well, what do? I want to get into this field. Well, first off, most of them said, well, we did it by accident, which I found extremely unhelpful career advice because I was trying to do it on purpose. But their advice was, well, I mean, increasingly we hire people with PhDs. So, well, all right. So I applied to PhD programs. Looking back, that was a very narrow window in time when the Smithsonian, even the Smithsonian was thinking that way about who it hired. And even then, the Smithsonian is a very, very singular and odd example of an American museum. But one of the themes you've heard is about the twists and turns and unpredictability of one's career. That's the advice I got, and so that's what I did. I went to Yale in American Studies. I was a friend and colleague of classmate of Ed Balson's here. And for me, I chose American Studies because I had an inkling that maybe American Studies would be more interdisciplinary and maybe more open to things that museum people did. But for me, American Studies was really history or cultural history in the way that I approached it. So ultimately, I would say that the advice I got was bad advice. I mean, frankly, in one sense, and I'll go on to tell you why I think it worked out for me. But bad advice that more than I really realized, and you seem more aware as a group than I was, but more than I realized, you know, graduate school is a pre-professional school for professors, and I was going to a pre-professional school for professors not wanting to be a professor, and so there was a mismatch there from the start. And my advisor, you know, I told people, including my advisor, but then we'd be talking, and then he'd always say, oh yeah, you want to do something else. That's right, I forget. And then he'd go back to sort of, you know, bludgeoning my dissertation into a book, you know. And so no one there, or very few people there, seemed to understand or want to mentor me, at least, in this. And we didn't have forums like this, I don't think. At least I wasn't aware of them. So I did some museum-related stuff in the summers, mostly. I taught a couple classes that were relevant to museum things while I was there. But then I finished and I went to go on the job market, and I had a really hard time finding a job in museums. And I actually think the PhD hurt my chances. And I want to talk a little bit about why in a second. But anyway, ultimately I did. I got a job at an institution and in a town that I had never heard of, the Outagamie County Historical Society and Houdini Historical Center in Appleton, Wisconsin. Houdini's, he claimed it as his hometown. I was there for 3 years. It's a long story.
And he escaped.
He escaped. No, he loved it. His dad was the rabbi there. Anyway, I was there for 3 years, and then I was at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, which is the state museum, for 9 years. And then 9 years ago, I came to University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And I'm not, the point of my remarks here are not to introduce you to the museum world. So I'm not going to go into all that in a lot of detail. If you have questions about this afterwards, about, you know, the field of public history and what's involved in it, or teaching public history, we can talk about that later. But so what were the problems I had in getting a job? I think there were 3 assumptions that were placed on me because I had a PhD that came out of my degree. One was that I would have no sense of how regular people understood or cared about history. The second was that I wouldn't be able to write a straight sentence. And the third was that I wouldn't be able to get along with or work with regular people. And I actually think that given the structure and the priorities of graduate education, those assumptions were deserved, were accurate about the field as a whole. So I want to look at each of those three assumptions, talk about how traditional graduate training unfortunately reinforces them, and then say, though, that in each case, in each of those three realms that I want to talk about, in each case, I think graduate school has the potential to turn those assumptions on its head, if you go into it thinking about it the way that you've been encouraged all morning to by the people who preceded me here. And then finally, in each case, I want to say that to really make it work, to make it stick and to transform the field, I think there needs to be a kind of shift in the culture of graduate training programs, both and shift individually among you and us, and that is that sort of individual and collective change in terms of culture, what people would call institutional culture or values, is what really I think is going to happen and needs to happen to make this really work beyond just getting to a job. All right, well, so ultimately, I think I actually did get a good and useful training for public history. I just had to look at it differently while I was going through it, look at what was being offered me differently, and apply it in different ways, and then ultimately think about myself differently. There's some identity issues in this, right, that came up earlier, too. So now I'm looking at those three assumptions that I felt sort of dogged by. The first one was that I would have no sense of how regular people understand history. And really that's a question of audience, right? Just for context, I once went to propose a course in public history at a university, not in North Carolina, and the department chair said, well, public history, don't we all do public history, all of us? You know, why do we need a course on public history? And what he meant was in the sense that all academics are public figures, and they all want people to understand their work, and they all give lectures and invite people to encounter it. But I think that's really different from what public history is, and a different way of thinking about audience than what a lot of non-academic history work demands. Because public history starts with audience. It depends on addressing a need or answering a question or seeing an opportunity to interact with audiences. And therefore, you make a series of decisions that are shaped by that audience as opposed to just being shaped by you. Because your goal is not just to talk at somebody, it's to have a kind of dialogue, and so it has to be someone on the other end. So fundamentally, there is a different measure of success, I think, in public history. And for those of you who aren't aspiring to public history, I would say more broadly, you have to have a different way of thinking about success when you begin to think about history beyond the academy, because the value system is different in that way. So just I'd be curious to hear what you say. What would you say in a research-intensive academic institution, how would you say, what does success depend on? What would you guess? What's the measure or the tool?
Publication.
All right, publication. But how do you determine a successful publication?
Citation.
Yeah.
Citation, yeah, okay.
Depending on this one.
Yeah,
Peer review.
yeah.
And the
I
words.
think citation and quality, and I think I would put all that under the umbrella of peer review. So that there's a community of peers that you are writing for and speaking to, and they're the evaluators, and that's ultimately, to me, in my experience, how success is measured. And so the size of that peer group is not particularly the question, right? And also, it's not particularly the question whether anyone outside that peer group actually understands what you're doing. I mean, that's not the point. I don't mean that in a cynical way, and I actually have come to appreciate peer review a lot more since I've been back in university, but that's how success is measured. Peer review among a group of experts, right? And so perhaps not surprisingly, academics' understanding of history seems arcane and narrow and subspecialized to people outside that world. When you pick up an academic monograph, you're entering into the middle of a conversation that people have already started long before you, and usually, all too often, I would say, there's no effort to catch you up, to say, well, this is what we've been talking about. You sort of sink or swim, because in that sense, that is the sort of self-contained aspect of that circle. I mean, sometimes even colleagues in your own department, in one's own department, we don't understand fully what each other is working on. And more importantly, we don't understand what is at stake in their work. And I think that that's maybe a useful way to think about, like, why is this being written? So that's, to me, the dilemma, or the challenge, and the first way in which our training limits our ability to reach outside the academy. But would PhD programs or would one's degree experience have to be that way? I don't think so. Because really, you in a PhD program should be able to describe what's at stake in your work. And usually, actually, I think we do know why. But I think there's a set of assumptions and expectations that cause us to hide it, to hide what's at stake, because the answers that we would give to people that would explain to them why they should care about it are the answers that make us most uncomfortable. And there's three answers that came to my mind. One is story, one is emotion, and the third is contemporary meaning. And so each of those three, I think, is a potential bridging point that we short circuit before it happens. So I just want to talk briefly about each of those three. Story means that what you're writing about is about people. It has some uncertainty. There's maybe some kind of arc, narrative arc of some sort to it. And then emotion, I mean partly emotion in the sense of paying attention to the emotional human motivations of the people you're writing about. That you're writing about people who act like people. But I also mean emotion in your own self. And this came up before in a way that I thought was interesting. Acknowledging that you have passion about what you're writing about, and that you care about it, that you have a stake in this. I think we all do, at least the people who actually manage to finish their dissertations have a stake and passion for what they're writing about, but I think we're embarrassed to acknowledge it. We cover it up with passive voice and jargon because that is not what a professional person is supposed to do. And I guess most simply, I'm saying that, and you heard it earlier when you guys were talking about interviewing for teaching positions, that is actually a self-limiting thing to do, to squelch your passion in your writing and in your presentation. And then the third one was contemporary meaning, the idea that there's something useful to take from this book. Presentist is a dirty word to historians, but I don't think it should be, or at least contemporary resonance shouldn't be. It's just saying that what we're working on has the potential to shape the way we and our readers and our audiences see things, shape the questions we ask, shape the assumptions that we all carry around with us, and ultimately maybe how we act. And I think that that's a good thing in our scholarship, and again, I think it's there in our topics, but we don't let it come out. So all those things, I think there are these potential connecting points to outside audiences and therefore outside employers, but that we have been given the message that we need to cloak these, and I think that that's a mistake. But again, I think if we set out to have a sense of audience, if we resolve to do so, I actually think grad school can be a good way to learn these skills. You've, I think, mostly been taught how to assert that you are making an historiographical intervention, right? I mean, that's the level of so what that you've been taught. But that same skill, it's the same skill that you could then use if you just reach it a little more broadly, a little more fearlessly, and speak a little more bluntly. That same skill is the skill that you need to be able to assert so what, essentially, to outside audiences. So I think in other words, you have that skill set. You just need to think of it differently in order to think about the audience differently. And I think you can practice that skill, and for all kinds of practical reasons. If you want to get your book published, you may have been told this, but I think you really need to have a 30-second elevator speech version of what is your book about. Like literally in the time that elevator is going down, you should be able to tell someone what it's about, what your book's about, and why it's important. And then I think you should have a 3-minute version for when you're sitting next to someone at a lunch table, and have a little more time, and they're sitting down, you can actually talk to them. But you don't need a 30-minute version. You need a 3-minute version, so that you can say concisely. So I think that even within the academy, you may be getting these skills, or you should. I think you can literally practice those skills, those elevator speeches. But then to push a little further though, I think that is the skill set that transfers. That ability to say so what and to say it concisely is what structures a good exhibit in a museum. It's what is the spine of a good documentary or public program of any sort. So you just need to hone that skill and value it, I think, to make the translation. And in the same way, this idea that we cloak our passion is correctable within your own PhD program because you're around people who are passionate. I mean, my experience of graduate school is that people really do care about ideas. They debate them in class. They debate them at the bar, and that they're really that it's there. It's just that we drain it out of our work as it gets close to actual audience, and I think that's again, I think that's self-limiting. So the skills and outlooks that you need, I think, are close at hand within your training and your program. You just need to sort of consciously think about applying them to engage audiences who are non-specialists, and that involves starting from where audiences actually are, not where you wish they would be, where they actually are in terms of how they think about history, and then building bridging points to them. What is going to be, not that you dispense with what you want to say, but how are you going to find a link, a connecting point, a starting point for them? So I don't think it means dumbing down, but you need to show them what is at stake. You need to entice them, you need to move them, and then finally, I think you need to consider what format is the best one to reach them at that level. So not everything should be a book, not everything should be a museum exhibit, not everything should be a documentary, but what do you have to say? What's the best format for it? Could your book also be a website, a podcast, an exhibit, or could some part of it be to broaden your skill set and broaden your reach? All right, so then as I said at the beginning, in each of the areas I want to talk about, I think there's also the potential for a culture shift in terms of how we think about ourselves as a field. And so in terms of this question of audience, I think your generation of emerging professionals, you are the one that are poised to take the lead on changing how we think about this. So in the case of audience-centered scholarship, that change would mean taking a broader definition of what counts as work, what counts as academic work in our field, what counts as scholarship, what does it look like, what does it sound like. I've had this experience many times myself, so I'll just share this. where so if someone like me speaks excitedly about an exhibit that we're working on, gives a sort of passionate so what for why it's important, don't then say, oh, that's so interesting. So what are you working on? That literally happens because on the one hand, the field has changed enough that they're able to say, oh, that sounds really interesting, but it hasn't changed enough for them to recognize it as work. They just think, well, that must be service, or that must be your hobby or something, right? This is a change that's in some ways bigger than you individually. It needs to happen at the level of tenure policies. It is happening. Our tenure policy is completely changed at UNCG. If you're interested in this, check out a joint report that the American Historical Association, the National Council on Public History, and I think the Organization of American Historians issued about tenure a few years ago, and also an organization called Imagining America that wrote a set of recommendations about tenure policies. So it needs to happen at that level, but I think it also has to happen at the level of individual people. And that's the part that you can control more directly, which is how you react to each other's work, how you value audience in your own working and each other's. And then if you do end up being one of the ones who ends up with that tenure check drive at the elite university where really you are in a position to and have the time to write those monographs that you're being trained to do, well, are you going to then leave behind everyone that you've had this conversation with this morning? I think that really is a big question. Like, if those people then continue to recognize whatever alternative academic career that the rest of you take, and to recognize their work as work in them as scholars or historians or whatever name they take, that has a tremendous amount of power, and I think that's in your control. All right, that's the longest one, I promise. That was all about audience-centered work. The second thing second stereotype I faced was that I wouldn't be able to write a straight sentence. And that connects, obviously, to the question of audience, but it's particularly sort of visible and embarrassing aspect of academic work, I think, at least among many academics. There's a great article I encourage you to read by Steven Pinker in the Chronicle of Higher Education called "Why Academics Stink at Writing," and he has this quote. This is quoting him. He says, "Why are people who devote their lives to the world of ideas so inept at conveying them?" So he has all kinds of reasons. I want to focus on two reasons that I think maybe account for this. The first connects to that, what constitutes success question that I asked earlier, which is sort of the assumption that really brilliant thought must be impossible to understand. And there's something really insidious about that, but I think it's that we carry that assumption. The very first conference paper I gave was at the American Studies Association. I was still in graduate school, and me and 3 of my graduate student colleagues gave papers, and we were really nervous, and we prepared, and afterwards, everyone came up to them and said, "Oh, that was brilliant, fascinating, oh, wow," and then people came up to me and said, "That was so clear," and I was deeply offended. That it was not brilliant, it was clear, and it's taken me 20 years to realize that, well, maybe that is not necessarily the insult that I took it to be at the time. That maybe they actually understood and they didn't understand the other ones, or anyway, the sort of the either-or aspect of that, either clear or brilliant, that I carried pretty deep within me, I realized, is a problem. And I think it contributes to a lot of bad writing, and I guess implicit in this is that if you can't, well, I'll get to this in a minute, but the bad writing is a serious handicap to you as you try to do anything outside of the university. So the first is kind of that set of assumptions, but the second reason why I think writing is bad is actually more of a cognitive or intellectual problem that connects to the so what challenge that I was issuing earlier. Writing teachers talk about reader-based versus writer-based prose. And writer-based prose well, reader-based prose is when you have made the effort to think about not just what do you think, but what would someone on the outside need to know in order to be able to get to the point that you have arrived at. Writer-based prose, you just take them through the process that you yourself have gone through, or worse, just take them to the point where you've arrived at and not explain what it is that lays behind it. So I think actually, in some cases, we just haven't been taught how to write in that way. That you need to be able to lay out an assertion, an overarching assertion. You need to be able to set out mileposts at the outset that tell the reader this is where we're going. And then you need to be able to guide the reader through them and so that they know where they're at and where they're headed along the way. I find with my graduate students, who are not getting PhDs mostly, but they think they know how to do this. And they are insulted almost when I say, well, we're going to work on essentially what in high school you would call a 5-paragraph essay. You know, that they're the thesis statement, the 3 supports, and but they don't know how to do it. And I also edited a lot of journal articles and exhibit reviews, and frankly, a lot of professors don't know how to do it, or they're not putting in the effort to do it. And I think that there's this sort of feeling that, well, you leave that behind. And I would really challenge that. I don't think you leave that behind. I think you maybe get more elegant at it, you maybe complicate it a little bit, but that structure of, I am making an assertion, this is what it's about, this is why it matters, this is where we're going, here's some evidence, you know, that is a way of thinking that really should run through your writing, and that I think often doesn't. And I think for all those reasons, good, clear writing is not taught or valued enough in PhD programs. But I do think, again, that you are being prepared to be a good writer if you want to be. I actually think in most cases, it happens in a realm that is also undervalued, and that's in teaching. I think actually it's in teaching that you're probably most likely getting the skills that you could then apply. I'm saying the non-academic jobs would value. Because if you're a good teacher, you're thinking about, well, how do I introduce this to newcomers, this idea? You know, what is it that I'm trying to get across to them? Like, what is the essence of it? Because I can't teach them everything. Like, what is the core? What is the roadmap that I'm going to lay out for them? How am I going to structure this discussion or this class? How am I going to create kind of waysides or rest points for people to pause and think and reflect for themselves and make connections? So to do that kind of teaching, you need the kind of clarity, flexibility, and sharpness that is what I think you need in your writing for it to reach out and succeed in the wider world. So in this realm too, obviously there is the potential for a cultural shift. And that one would be to try to mitigate your insecurity about writing clearly and directly, and again to value in each other someone who is able to write with some life. And I think the more that we can challenge the value system that puts opaque and ponderous at the top, I think the farther ahead we'll be, and that will help serve you better in whatever realm that you go to, but certainly beyond the academy. All right, and then the final one was this idea of that I would not be able to work with regular people. And again, I actually think that this reputation is somewhat deserved. We who get PhDs tend to be the people who have, for 20 years of schooling, been the smartest person in the room, right? And we've been rewarded for that. And that is somewhat dangerous if you think about what the implications of that are. And that's an implication that's reinforced often in traditional academic work. You see it in tenure cases for sure, where there's a premium placed on individual work. what did you do yourself? And then when you go up for tenure, anything that you did not do individually, you have to explain and justify, and if possible, prove that actually you did do most of it. Like, why is your name not listed first on this article or book? What was your percentage of this work that you actually did? So there's all these messages that devalue collaboration, right? So collaboration, that is in a way, of the skills I'm talking about, it's probably the softest, quote, soft skill. And actually, I think, though, the hardest one for us to overcome in terms of your training and how you think about it. But I will say, for what it's worth, that everything that you do outside the academy is collaborative. I mean, that is how things get done, and I actually think it's for the best that's how things get done. But that's not the message we give to the outside world about ourselves. So when I got this job at the Allegheny County Historical Society in Appleton, every spring we would have to, it was an old 1920s former Masonic temple, the museum was, and every spring we would have to lug the air conditioners out of the basement and lift them up into the windows, and every spring the director would say, well, I bet that's not what you thought you were going to be doing when you got your PhD at Yale. And I just could not shake that assumption that that she thought, that I thought that this was below me, no matter how vigorously I was trying to lift. And so, I'm not, what, does anyone aspire to lift air conditioners? Well, no, not particularly, but I did aspire very consciously to be part of a team. And I think that was not, she found that hard to believe, even though in all these other ways, I won't go into it, but in all these other ways, I really was very successfully being part of a team of people. That was a wonderful experience for me. But she always had to make that remark. I didn't fully understand, though, what collaborative work meant until I left Wisconsin and went to the museum in Minnesota, which is, I think, the largest state museum in the country. It's a huge place. Because when I was in Wisconsin, I always thought, well, I'm doing this collaborative work, and it's good because I wish there could be 10 of me, because then, boy, I would be making great exhibits. But I can't have 10 of me, so I've got these 10 colleagues, But when I went to Minnesota, I realized that that's not actually the right way to think about collaboration. I didn't need 10 of me. I needed 10 others, or in Minnesota's case, 25 or 30, because what I mean is that the other people that I was working with had skill sets that I don't have. And so to be able to work with a media developer, a museum educator, a collection specialist, a marketing person, a exhibit fabricator, all these people had skills that I didn't have. It was way better than having 10 of me. We were able to do something together that no one of us, no 10 replicons, could have done. And that's really when I began to recognize the potential of collaboration, and I won't go into this, but also how hard it is, how much work it takes to get people with all those different skill sets to work together. So again, I think so. Then to think about your potential to be a collaborator is a different way of thinking about what you potentially bring to a workplace. And I don't think it's usually valued in the academy. But I do think that there are ways that you can learn that lesson in graduate school if you're willing to listen. And one of them is through something I've heard a couple people talk about already today, the power of interdisciplinary scholarship. Well, why do we all at least pay lip service to this, or in some cases really do it? Well, we think, oh, it's so great to hear other people's perspectives. People who don't think the way I do, it yields something better than I would have thought of myself. So that's embedded in universities, sometimes more, sometimes less, but that's a potential kind of way to practice or value one kind of collaboration. I think the recent trend toward digital humanities centers and such is another great example, because you're seeing people from different departments and different skills, with different skills coming together, quantitative skills, computer programming, graphic design, and then interpretive skills as well. My own work often involves oral history, and if you think about that, that really is the premise of oral history, is that other people have something to say that I haven't thought of, and that I benefit from listening to them. The other reason I have all my students do oral history is even as they're being trained to sort of assume the expert voice, then they go do oral histories and realize that they are not the experts on this topic that the person is talking about. The person lived it, right? And so I think that's a very healthy lesson to realize that just because we've read it all or pretend we've read it all does not mean that we really are the expert. So I think that this probably is the biggest culture shift that would be required. It's to recognize and value the power of collaboration. And I think this fits with what was said earlier about paying not just attention to skill set, but to mindset. I think there are a couple of things that you can do consciously, I think, to be more receptive and open to this. One is just to have in your mind a general willingness to pitch in and to learn from each other, as opposed to trying to claw your way to the top. I will say that for all the job reference calls that I get for my students and alums who are applying for jobs outside the academy, never has anyone asked me, is this student the most brilliant? Is their work the most brilliant work that you've seen? They don't ask that. In the same way that they're not going to ask you, what exactly is your dissertation topic? They want to know, can this student or alum work with my staff? Are they going to be able to collaborate? Are they going to be able to join a creative team? So that's one, it's just sort of that kind of outlook. Then the second one is, I think, that it's important to nourish your outside life. And that may seem like a disconnect, but it's not. I think if you think about the importance of your life outside of your dissertation, outside of your academic work, you'll be a healthier person, but you will also be a better worker, because you will have a broader range of influences, a broader range of inspirations to draw on. I actually think you'll be a better scholar, for what it's worth. But I really think, in terms of, since my topic is non-academic jobs, you will be better positioned to join a team and be a creative person with a adaptable skill set that they will value. So that requires a culture shift, partly in actually making the time to nourish your outside life, which is very difficult, I know. But the other part of it is actually to allow yourself to share that with each other, to acknowledge that maybe you do have an outside life. And I think that is something that is somewhat frowned on in academia, especially at the level of professors. I find I've come to be disturbed by the fact that if you ask people, how was your spring break? They can't own up to having had a spring break. They'll say, well, I didn't really have one, or well, I did, but actually I did most work most of the time, or there's a shame in having done something else. Where I actually think it's very difficult to carve out the time to do something else, but that's one problem. But the other problem is to acknowledge and be pleased to share that, yes, I did X and Y. I went hiking. I don't know, whatever it is. So I think that's the second culture shift. And then the third is to recognize, this connects to the questions that were being asked about what to say in an interview. It's a shift in mindset to prepare yourself to go to a job, to join an organization outside the academy, and be willing and eager to learn things that you don't know, as opposed to figuring, well, I surely know everything, and I'm going to share it with them, or I'm going to try to not be too overpowering. You know, no, you're going to go there and learn things that you have not thought of, and that's going to be wonderful. And that is something that you need to be able to convey. You need to be passionate about what you have done, but you need to be able to convey an openness and a humbleness about learning from the people who you're going to be working for, even though they don't have PhDs, right? So that you're fighting that stereotype about yourself, and I think that that's a very important mental orientation to take. Okay, so to wrap up, as I said in the title of this, I think we often shoot ourselves in the foot when we try to think about how to use our PhD to connect to non-academic jobs because of the way we are approaching our work, the way we're self-describing, and the way we're orienting ourselves to it. But I actually think a PhD can prepare you, and actually has, and I think if you think a little differently about what you actually are learning, take advantages of the opportunities within your programs, perhaps to learn somewhat differently along the way. Think directly and openly about how to explain to others the skills that you've gained. And then realize that you're asking, when you go out to look for a job, you're asking for a chance to humbly learn from people who know new and different things that you probably can't imagine yet. So again, I think even asking the question that is being asked at this gathering is terrific, is a big step toward the culture shift that I was advocating. And I'm actually very optimistic about the state of the field. I think things have changed a lot since I was so determined not to go into the university. So I'm optimistic about the state of the field in that way, and optimistic about your place within it. There's a whole world of history out there for you to explore and contribute to, and I hope you will find it and make a difference, and that it will bring you joy. So thank you.
Thank you.